This movie is extremely hard to believe. A wealthy businessman who enjoyed abusing his wife was one day found dead in his own living room, under intense pressure from the police. His wife, who was the prime suspect, was forced to confess to the crime. However, no one could have imagined that the case would twist again and again, and that the final truth would completely shatter common moral expectations. Believe me, if you can guess the real culprit without finishing the movie, I will wash my hair upside down in the next video. The story opens with a high-impact scene, as a fatal incident occurs in an upscale residential area, and the victim is a billionaire entrepreneur. After discovering that the man had repeatedly abused his wife during his lifetime, the police immediately listed the wife, Yoon-ae, as a suspect, and quickly had her write a confession. The police originally thought the case would end that easily, but the appearance of a rookie lawyer suddenly made the trial far more complicated. Although Yoon-ae admitted to the crime, she was still entitled to legal assistance, which was basically just a procedural formality. What lawyer Young-min could not understand was that Yoon-ae had no intention of explaining what had happened at all, and only asked him to tell the judge to proceed with the sentencing as soon as possible. This led Young-min to form a suspicion that perhaps Yoon-ae was not the one who killed her husband, because there were clear irregularities in the case details. First of all, according to the forensic report, a lethal dose of sedatives had been injected into the victim, and while he was in deep sleep, the killer applied industrial adhesive to both his nose and mouth. But the strange part was that if Yoon-ae had turned herself in, the police should have found the adhesive at the crime scene, yet they found nothing. This suggested that Yoon-ae might be lying, either because she had an unspeakable reason, or because she was pressured into confessing by the police. Even though Young-min's analysis was logical and he decided to defend Yoon-ae as not guilty, she still insisted that she was the murderer, and only asked him to repeat that statement in court, before standing up and leaving without looking back. Seeing Yoon-ae's utterly hopeless attitude, the perceptive Young-min became even more convinced that the case was far from simple, and he was determined to uncover the truth. He soon further confirmed his suspicions, learning from police records that Yoon-ae's husband was a famous businessman who owned billions in assets and had purchased multiple life insurance policies, which meant Yoon-ae did have a motive on the surface. However, the police also found a crime planning diary that recorded the exact dosage of sedatives, clearly suggesting that Yoon-ae had long intended to kill her abusive husband, yet she had no intention of taking any of the inheritance, which indicated there had to be another reason behind her actions. While Young-min was deeply puzzled by this, his assistant suddenly brought him a package, and inside a Bible. One page was marked with a bookmark, with a sentence highlighted in bold marker. Young-min suspected that someone was trying to help Yoon-ae, so he immediately went back to the detention center and asked her if she knew who had sent the package. He believed that the highlighted sentence was meant to encourage Yoon-ae not to give up on life, and Young-min asked her to place her hand on the Bible and honestly tell him everything she knew about the case. But despite the appearance of someone offering help, Yoon-ae still insisted that she was the killer. Left with no choice, Young-min decided to strike at Yoon-ae's emotional weak point.
그럼 민지는요? 아이한테는 엄마가 필요하잖아요. 옆에 있어줘야죠. 유나 씨가 이렇게 놔버리면 민지는 누가 돌보죠?
저 몸을 어떡하라고요?
최선을 다해야죠. 최선을 다해서 재판 치르고 아이한테 돌아가야죠.
Soon the first court session arrived, and the prosecutor began by stating that Yoon-ae had a poor relationship with her husband and frequently suffered abuse, which led her to develop the intent to kill him. At around 2 a.m. on August 21st, Yoon-ae allegedly injected a lethal dose of sedatives into her husband's right arm while he was asleep, and after he completely lost consciousness, poured strong construction adhesive into his nose and mouth, causing him to suffocate. Young-min immediately objected to this claim, arguing that the prosecution had no solid evidence, and that Yoon-ae was a long-term victim who was completely controlled by her unstable husband, leaving her without the ability or courage to commit such an act. Recalling Young-min's earlier reminder that her daughter needed proper care, Yoon-ae decided to withdraw her confession on the spot and file an appeal.
피고인도 변호인과 같은 생각이십니까? 피해자를 살해한 사실이 없다는 얘기죠? 네.
Before gathering more evidence and scheduling the next hearing, Young-min informed Yoon-ae that he would request the police to testify, as he suspected that her confession had been made under extreme pressure, and that the entire interrogation process needed to be examined for possible coercion. The judge responded that he would also summon the victim's sister to testify about Yoon-ae's relationship with her husband, considering that the case had become increasingly complex. And in the interest of fairness, the judge decided to question the police first and have the victim's sister testify at the third hearing. Even without absolute confidence of winning, Young-min still gave Yoon-ae encouragement, believing that only by taking a step forward could there be any chance at all. Realizing that Young-min was genuinely trying to help her, Yoon-ae lowered her guard and asked him to visit her daughter, as she worried that her sick mother could not properly care for her 7-year-old child. Young-min kindly agreed, but to his surprise, Min-ji showed no concern for her mother's situation and simply kept drawing by herself. Seeing that Min-ji had no intention of responding, Young-min could only leave after offering his greetings. 2 weeks later, the next hearing arrived, and Young-min presented a video recorded by a bystander that captured the reenactment of the crime.
눌러줘. 그렇지. 나 부으라고 좀. 앉으라고. 아니 접착제를 이렇게 딱 해가지고 이렇게 좀 부으라니까 좀. 얼굴에다 부었잖아. 여기. 그다음 접착제 어떻게 했어? 그다음 얘는 어떻게 했냐니까?
From the footage alone, it was clear that Yoon-ae had not confessed voluntarily, and no matter how the police captain tried to justify it, the truth was obvious to everyone. Young-min then asked Yoon-ae to explain what had happened, and she stated that night, her husband not only abused her again as usual, but also forced himself on her, and afterwards suggested that they inject sedatives and sleep. She woke up a little after 1 a.m., feeling an overwhelming sense of suffocation, so she quietly went out for a drive to clear her head. But when she returned, she discovered that her husband's nose and mouth had been sealed, and he was already dead. Yoon-ae believed that during that time, someone else had secretly entered the house and killed her husband, but she had no idea who it was, only knowing that he had already been injected with sedatives before his death, and that the dosage increased over time. The police then asked Yoon-ae whether she had injected her husband again after waking up, because their investigation showed that no outsider had entered the house, meaning the victim could not have done it himself. Young-min immediately objected, arguing that the police were merely speculating without concrete evidence, and that based on Yoon-ae's testimony, a third party must have entered the house, committed the crime, and framed her. As both sides continued to argue endlessly, the judge realized the trial would not conclude anytime soon, and decided to adjourn the court. Before leaving the courthouse, the prosecutor stopped Young-min and asked why he was being so persistent, pointing out that the case was practically settled and could have been resolved as a formality, while also hinting not to ruin his own future. Young-min dismissed the warning, because his deeply rooted sense of justice would not allow him to ignore an innocent person. However, no matter how confident Young-min was, the case was destined to be extremely difficult, because an unexpected incident occurred the very next day. When Yoon-ae was placed in handcuffs by prison guards, it turned out that shortly after the previous hearing ended, the husband's sister visited Yoon-ae and offered a tempting condition, promising that as long as Yoon-ae pleaded guilty and transferred Min-ji's custody to her, she would help Yoon-ae at the third hearing by testifying that her brother abused Yoon-ae and solidifying the claim, which could result in a suspended sentence. Yoon-ae immediately understood the real motive, realizing that Ji-young was trying to use Min-ji to obtain a massive inheritance worth tens of billions. Believing that someone was finally helping her, Yoon-ae refused the deal without hesitation. What she did not expect was that before leaving, the cunning Ji-young told her that she had already submitted the relevant documents to the court, and that judges concerned about the child's future would soon approve the transfer of custody. Those words instantly ignited Yoon-ae's anger.
난 죽이지 않았어요. 억울한 표정 짓지 마. 솔직히 너 매일매일 죽이고 싶었잖아. 당신도 나만큼 죽이고 싶었잖아. 그래도 너만큼은 아니었어. 한번 잘 생각해 보세요.
Stimulated by the threat, Yoon-ae had a terrifying nightmare that night, dreaming that her young daughter was truly taken away. And under immense pressure, she lost control and had a physical confrontation with the guards. After learning that Yoon-ae had broken down because of Ji-young, Young-min patiently comforted her, telling her that she had done well so far, that much of the police evidence was already invalid, and that the only remaining threat was Ji-young, and that as long as Ji-young's testimony could be overturned, both the judge and the public would sympathize with Yoon-ae, greatly increasing the chances of winning the case. Once Yoon-ae cleared her name, no matter how much material Ji-young submitted, it would be useless, so now she had to pull herself together and face the trial with strength. Young-min's reassuring words instantly dispelled Yoon-ae's fear. However, even though both of them felt optimistic, harsh reality showed no mercy, because at the same time, the prosecution reviewed surveillance footage and discovered that after Yoon-ae woke up first in the middle of the night, she had stayed for a while at a riverside park, and if their assumption was correct, Yoon-ae had likely gone there to meet the killer. To verify this theory, the prosecution was fortunate enough to find a witness. When the third hearing arrived, The prosecution did not call Ji-young to testify, but instead questioned the witness first. The man, who had been jogging at night, admitted that he noticed Yoon-ae because she was wearing thick clothes in the heat, and he saw her get into a car and immediately embraced the driver. Due to the angle and the darkness, he could not confirm whether Yoon-ae kissed the driver, nor could he clearly see the driver's appearance or clothing, but the only thing he was certain about was that the car was a very noticeable white Audi. After hearing this testimony, the prosecution concluded that based on the current situation, Yoon-ae had met with her lover that night and then conspired together to kill her husband. Yoon-min immediately expressed his disagreement, stating that there were reasons to suspect the witness had been planted, and requested to question the man further. Yoon-min challenged him by pointing out that 2 full months had already passed since the incident, and asked whether the man truly remembered the events clearly, and since he could not describe specific details now, whether it was possible that he had mistaken someone else for Yoon-ae. The man immediately refuted this, firmly stating that he remembered it very clearly and swore that the person he saw that night was indeed Yoon-ae. Yoon-min originally intended to continue applying pressure with his questioning to expose inconsistencies, but Yoon-ae wrote a sentence on a notebook and privately admitted this fact to Young-min. This sudden confession completely caught Young-min off guard, leaving him no choice but to stop questioning. The prosecution then demanded that Yoon-ae respond and explain who she had met that night.
피고인은 그 점에 대해서 진술을 거부하겠습니다. 그건 개인적인 사생활이고 본건과 관련이 없기 때문입니다.
제가 잘 이해가 안 돼서 그러는데 내연남과 공모한 게 아니라면 왜 누군지 못 밝힙니까? 피고인의 무죄를 증명해 줄 수도 있는 증인인데요.
As Yoon-ae stubbornly refused to admit or explain anything, the third hearing had to be temporarily concluded. At this point, Ji-young's testimony became crucial, but the situation had already turned extremely unfavorable for Young-min's side. Reporter Soo-ah could not help feeling puzzled, as she could not understand why Yoon-ae, having decided to retract her confession, still refused to reveal the truth to Young-min. After learning that Yoon-ae would rather terminate the defense and plead guilty than reveal who that person was, Soo-ah felt the case had no chance of being won. However, the section chief encouraged Young-min not to lose heart, pointing out that if Ji-young were to have a change of conscience and step forward to plead for Yoon-ae before the judge, there would still be a chance to win the case. Although the words were like a shot in the arm, Young-min still felt deeply uneasy. Fortunately, just as he was at a loss, the fax machine suddenly received an anonymous tip, stating that Ji-young had once worked as a nurse at a hospital, was highly skilled in using anesthetics, and could precisely control sedative dosages to euthanize critically ill pets. Seeing that the sender signed the message as Havana, Yoon-min realized that the mysterious helper was aiding Yoon-ae again, and the message was clearly hinting that the real killer might be Ji-young. To further confirm whether Ji-young was still using sedatives to secretly take euthanasia jobs for pets, and whether such methods could also be applied to humans, they quickly came up with a perfect plan. After successfully contacting Ji-young online, Soo-ah brought the section chief's elderly dog to Ji-young's home, pretending to request euthanasia, and sure enough, Ji-young was still engaged in this gray area business.
이제 주세요. 오늘 하루만 더 고민해보고 연락드리겠습니다.
잠깐만요. 잘해드려요. 직접 맞으시는 것도.
Fortunately, Soo-ah managed to leave safely in the end and successfully recorded the entire conversation. When the fourth hearing arrived, Ji-young did not immediately answer the prosecution's questions, but first cried to the judge about her brother, stating that she now had a responsibility to raise her niece Min-ji and would definitely take care of her until she grew up. She then fabricated testimony unfavorable to Yoon-ae, telling the court that before his death, her brother was actually somewhat afraid of his wife Yoon-ae, because whenever the couple argued, Yoon-ae would also resort to physical confrontation. She also claimed that her brother had once told her that Yoon-ae had another man outside the marriage and seemed to be plotting to kill him. Ji-young's motive was clearly exposed, as all she truly wanted was to pin the crime on Yoon-ae, obtain custody of Min-ji, and inherit the estate. Seeing that Ji-young had no intention of helping Yoon-ae at all, Yoon-min pointed out her motive and focused his questioning, first reminding everyone present that once Yoon-ae was convicted, the inheritance would belong to Min-ji, and if Ji-young became the guardian, she would have the right to freely use the estate until Min-ji turned 18. Yoon-min then directly asked whether Ji-young intended to control her brother's inheritance, and when Ji-young responded that doing so would be reasonable, Yoon-min immediately exposed her weak point. He revealed that before Yoon-ae's husband died, Ji-young had tried to borrow money from her brother for investments, but not only was she refused, her brother also mocked Ji-young's husband as being incompetent. And from that moment on, Ji-young and her husband harbored deep resentment and constantly desired the brothers' wealth, which was further confirmed by Ji-young repeatedly calling major insurance companies to inquire about her brother's compensation payouts. Realizing that she was about to be identified as the killer, Ji-young desperately tried to explain that she had nothing to do with it, but no matter how hard she defended herself, she could not escape the trap Young-min had set.
증인은 프로포폴을 사람한테도 놓지요. 즉, 증인의 주된 고객은 사실 반려동물이 아니라 음성적으로 프로포폴을 맞으려는 사람들이죠.
계속 이런 식이면 답변 거부하겠습니다.
다시 묻겠습니다. 증인이 프로포폴을 이성진 씨한테 제공해 왔지요?
그런 적 없습니다.
증인, 혹시 사건 당일 오빠 집에 갔었습니까?
대답 안 하겠습니다. 안 갔습니다.
오빠 이성진 씨가 약을 하는 때를 기다렸다가 증인이 몰래 집에 들어가 치사랑의 프로포폴을 주사한 거 아닙니까?
그런 적 없습니다.
재판장님, 변호인은 지금 아무 증거 없이 증인을 무고하고 있습니다.
변호인, 그만하시죠.
알겠습니다. 이상입니다.
Although Young-min then attempted to play the recorded conversation as evidence, the judge, considering the possibility of fabrication and in order to remain fair, rejected the request. Fortunately, Ji-young's testimony had lost its credibility, and since the case had already gone through 4 hearings, the judge decided that the next one would be the final trial. After the session ended, the judge met Young-min privately and reminded him that even if the recording were admitted as evidence, it would not be enough to guarantee Yoon-ae's acquittal, and that there was still no concrete evidence proving Ji-young was the killer, meaning Yoon-ae would most likely still be convicted at the next hearing. The judge then asked Young-min why he believed so firmly in Yoon-ae's innocence, and Young-min honestly replied that his intuition was extremely strong, believing that Yoon-ae had an unspeakable reason and would never kill her husband.
그래요. 결국은 그날 밤 만난 누군가가 나와야 되지 않을까 싶네요.
Although Young-min still refused to give up, he did not expect new trouble to arise. One day, while Yoon-ae's mother went out shopping, Ji-young suddenly began harshly questioning Min-ji, forcing her to describe what she had seen that night. Under Ji-young's near-hysterical interrogation, the already fragile Min-ji suddenly collapsed and lost consciousness. After learning what had happened, Young-min rushed to the hospital, and Min-ji told him that she was still very frightened, because she had just dreamed that her father was hurting her mother again, and Min-ji asked Young-min to promise that he would help her mother win the case, after which the exhausted Min-ji fell into a deep sleep once more. At that moment, Young-min happened to notice a bag on the cabinet with the word Havana on it, and he instantly thought of the mysterious helper. In order to find out who was helping Yoon-ae, Young-min followed the address and went straight to the bookstore, and when he saw multiple photos of Yoon-ae posted on the wall, he asked the owner about the details. The shop owner did not hide anything, and he told Young-min that one night he happened to see Yoon-ae wandering alone on the street in a dazed state, and he immediately realized that she had suffered abuse. So in order to help her pull herself together, he invited Yoon-ae to join the reading club there. After learning that the Bible belonged to the bookstore and that the fax machine had also sent out materials before, Young-min instantly understood what was going on. Without delay, he went to question Yoon-ae again, and in order to make her reveal everything she was hiding, Young-min reminded her that according to the information he had gathered, the police planned to call Min-ji to testify at the final hearing, because they believed that Min-ji, who was at home that night, must have witnessed something. Hearing this, Yoon-ae immediately became anxious and unsettled, because she could not accept the idea of her 7-year-old daughter being tormented by police questioning. Seeing Yoon-ae's emotional defenses begin to crumble, Young-min took the opportunity to tell her that he had come from Havana's bookstore, that he already knew someone had been helping her, and that he hoped Yoon-ae would be honest and confirm whether the person she met that night was the bookstore owner, and whether that person was truly the killer, and if so, why she had chosen to hide it. But even though she realized there was no other option, Yoon-ae still refused to tell the truth, and insisted on terminating the defense and accepting punishment, believing that only this way could she protect the people around her.
이제 정말 다 자백할게.
거짓말 좀 그만해요. 유나 씨 도와주려고 하잖아요.
그만 가보시라고요.
유나 씨,
절 도와준다고요? 아무도 우리 못 도와줘요.
Yoon-ae's attitude finally left Young-min disheartened, and he had no choice but to accept her decision. Just when he thought everything had finally settled, as he was about to leave, Young-min noticed a white Audi parked outside, and seeing a couple's necklace hanging from the rearview mirror, he instantly recalled the witness's words, and wondered whether the owner of this car was the person Yoon-ae had met that night. To verify this suspicion, Young-min waited inside his car for the driver to appear. followed the car all the way to the bookstore, and became even more convinced that the truth was getting closer. When he walked inside and saw the driver's face, he finally understood why Yoon-ae had chosen to hide the truth. Soon it was the day of the final trial, and before the prosecution could call Min-ji to testify, Young-min requested to call a witness first. The prosecution strongly objected at first, but when they heard that Young-min's temporary witness was the driver who had met Yoon-ae that night, they had no choice but to temporarily hold off on calling Min-ji. However, what no one expected was that this crucial witness had actually been in the courtroom all along.
이 사건 재판장인 최은주 부장판사입니다.
본 재판장 자신이 이 사건 증인으로 신청되었으므로 이 사건을 회피하도록 하겠습니다.
As a new judge took a seat on the bench, the original judge, Eun-ju, was summoned as a witness instead. Eun-ju did not shy away at all and openly admitted that she and Yoon-ae were in a romantic relationship. It turned out that Eun-ju was also a member of the reading club, and because they discovered they both loved the same book, the two naturally began talking endlessly, and over time, Eun-ju learned about Yoon-ae's situation, and perhaps driven by a deep sense of justice, she developed a desire to protect Yoon-ae, while Yoon-ae also found emotional support in her, and so whenever she suffered abuse from her husband again, Yoon-ae would go out late at night to find Eun-ju, calming herself and seeking comfort by her side. Therefore, in order to help Yoon-ae as much as possible, after Yoon-ae became entangled in the case of her husband's death, Eun-ju secretly provided Young-min with clues, guiding him toward the possibility of shifting suspicion onto Ji-young. After finishing her account, Eun-ju went on to explain that Yoon-ae left after meeting her at around 3 in the morning, while the victim's time of death was 2 o'clock, which meant that Yoon-ae had an alibi. After hearing this, Young-min added that he also had dashcam footage and audio recordings from that night, and that they could be reviewed if there were any doubts. Seeing that both of them firmly stood by their statements, the judge naturally accepted this side's testimony. Since it could now be proven that Yoon-ae was not the killer, the police had no choice but to classify the case as unresolved, and Yoon-ae was soon released without charges. To commemorate this wonderful day, Young-min decided to drive Yoon-ae and her family home, but just as he began to wonder who the real killer that night might have been, Min-ji's words caught his attention. Looking at the extremely abstract drawings on the wall, Young-min felt an indescribable sense of fear, and in the next moment, he finally understood the truth.
이건 어떤 아이가 그린 그림일까요?
그게 아이가 겪을 일은 아니었잖아요.
민지, 그날 자고 있었던 거 맞죠?
From Yoon-ae's meaningful expression, it became clear that the one who killed her husband that night was her daughter. It turned out that after witnessing her mother endure long-term abuse, Min-ji gradually became distorted under the pressure, and in order to vent her anger on her mother's behalf, when she discovered her father sleeping alone in the living room that night, Min-ji sealed his nose and mouth with adhesive, making her abusive father leave this world forever. And after Yoon-ae woke up first that night, she did indeed inject her husband with sedatives again, but only to prevent him from discovering that she had left the house to meet Eun-ju. After revealing the full truth, Yoon-ae burned all of her daughter's drawings, using this to tell Young-min that she would live well from now on, and Young-min chose not to pursue the matter any further. At the end of the story, Young-min finally became a full-fledged prosecutor and also built a family of his own. Whenever he thought back on Yoon-ae's case, the deeply reflective Young-min always believed that for him, the most important thing in life was not exposing facts, but safeguarding the truth. Although this may somewhat go against professional principles, in certain situations, from another perspective, it could also be seen as a way of confronting wrongdoing and upholding justice.